On the weekend of September 5th of 1993, a young couple headed up to northeastern Minnesota to spend the weekend fishing, kayaking, and camping. That weekend put their love of the outdoors to the test. But before we get into that encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness, where I share encounters with the unexplained. If you've had an encounter that you would like to share, please email it to me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button, as I'll be uploading multiple times every week. So don't forget to take that subscribe button with you camping, and reassure that those sounds outside the tent are just a bear, so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. This encounter comes from Kevin and Sarah, and it happened the weekend of September 5th of 1993. Kevin and Sarah are just your regular small-town Minnesota couple. Kevin was 22 at the time, and Sarah was 21, and they shared a very common love of the outdoors. They would go camping, fishing, and kayaking as often as they could. And on this particular weekend, they were actually heading to a place called Farm Lake, which is located up in the Superior National Forest in northeastern Minnesota. It's actually located kind of in between the Canadian border and Lake Superior itself. They had actually been out to Farm Lake a couple of times in the past, but on this particular weekend, they had their hearts set on trying this new spot to camp, which was located on the northeast side of the lake. There's almost like a big channel that runs to the northeast, and partway down that channel, just to the north, there's a small lake called Pickerel Lake. So where they had planned to set up camp was right along that main channel, right in line with Pickerel Lake itself. Now, they had been looking forward to this particular trip for quite a while because their schedules had gotten super busy over the last couple of months, and they did not get out nearly as much as they would normally like to. So they were really looking forward to getting out there, especially to try this new spot to camp. So on September 4th, they left their place, they drove to the Superior National Forest, and they actually used the small campground on the south shore of Farm Lake as their staging area. When they got there, they parked their vehicle, got their kayaks in the water, got them loaded up, and by this time it was about 6 o'clock in the evening. So they got in their kayaks and they started paddling across the lake. They were just taking their time, paddling side by side, talking and just enjoying each other's company. When they got to where they were going to be setting up camp, it was already getting pretty dark. It was about 9 o'clock at this point, but that did not faze them at all. They were very used to doing this type of stuff, so setting up camp in the dark was not a big deal for them. So as they got to where they were going to be setting up their camp, they pulled their kayaks over towards the shore, got out, pulled the kayaks up onto land, grabbed all their gear. Then they set up their tent, made a fire. They sat around the fire for a while. They roasted some hot dogs, had a couple of drinks, and just basically stayed up talking till about 12:30. At about 12:30, they decided they were going to wrap it in for the night, so they headed into their tent and went to bed. At about 2:30 in the morning, Sarah was awoken by the sound of something dragging through the dirt inside the campsite. She also heard the sound of footsteps moving around the tent, so she reached down beside her, gave Kevin a little bit of a shake to wake him up, and now the two of them were sitting there listening to what was going on just outside the tent. Kevin too heard these footsteps, and they definitely sounded like they were bipedal. So Kevin's first thought was that there was somebody messing around with them, somebody going through their camp. So he reached down beside him, grabbed his Smith & Wesson 5906 9mm, and made his way towards the zipper of the tent. He unzipped it just a little bit, kind of so he could peek just outside. He had his pistol in his hand, and out of the corner of his eye off to the right, he saw what he thought was a bear moving into the trees. So now he felt a little bit more relieved, because now he's figuring, okay, this is not a person, there's definitely a bear going around the camp. And he felt pretty secure with his pistol, so he told Sarah that it was just a bear and for her to go back to sleep, and that he would sit up just in case this bear came back. So that's exactly what Kevin did. He sat up for the rest of the night. Sarah went back to sleep. In the morning, right at the crack of dawn, the two of them got up, and as soon as they exited their tent, they noticed that something was not right. Where they had left their chairs the night before were right side by side, right in front of their fire pit. And when they got out of the tent, one of the chairs was on one side of the campsite, and the other chair was on the other side of the campsite. The chairs were not tipped over, they were still standing upright, but they found this to be really bizarre, especially Sarah, because now Sarah was telling Kevin that this was definitely a person, and Kevin just kept reassuring Sarah that no, this was just a bear. And it kind of caused a little bit of friction between the two, because Sarah was definitely convinced that it was not a bear, and Kevin was trying to convince her that it was. They kind of argued about it for a little while, but then they decided, you know what, let's just leave this behind us and go enjoy the day like we had planned. So they made some eggs over the fire, grabbed their fishing gear, and they headed out on their kayaks for a day of fishing. At about 4 o'clock, they came back to camp, and as soon as they pulled up, they noticed those two chairs again. When they had breakfast that morning, they actually moved those two chairs back to where they were the night before. And when they pulled up to camp, they noticed that those two chairs, again, were on opposite sides of the campsite. So that kind of put them at a little bit of unease, and they also noticed that their tent did not look right. So when they got their kayaks to shore, they got up and they walked towards their tent, and their tent had actually been pulled up from the pegs and dragged about 10 feet off to the side. Sarah at this point said to Kevin, this was not a bear. And Kevin again, though, he argued with her and said, no, this was just a bear. And he tried to make her feel better by pointing down to his pistol on his hip. Sarah kept pointing out to Kevin, though, that if this was a bear, why was her tent not ripped? And again, Kevin just kind of reassured her, pointed down to his pistol and said, whatever it is, we're going to be safe. Don't worry about it. So after a little while, Kevin went down to the water. He went to go clean their catch for the day so that they could have a fish fry dinner. And Sarah started making a fire. That night, they had their fish fry. They sat around the fire till about 11 o'clock, and then they went back into their tent to go to bed. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, Sarah was again woken up by noises outside the tent. She said it sounded almost like acorns were falling on the top of the tent. The problem is there was no trees that had acorns in this area. So she sat there for a second listening, and she could tell it was actually the sound of small rocks striking the side of the tent. So she again reached down, woke up Kevin. He sat up, and he was hearing the same thing she was. Once Kevin noticed that that was definitely the sound of rocks, his view changed instantly from all those other events being caused by a bear to Sarah being right and it was somebody messing with them. So he got pretty angry at that thought. So he yelled out that he was armed. When he yelled that out, he was greeted back with a wah. And that made him even more mad because now he's thinking he just let these people know that he's armed and that's how they replied. So he crawled over to the front of the tent, unzipped it just a little bit, stuck his pistol out the door, and fired one shot into the ground. When he did that, they could hear something take off into the trees running away from camp. So Kevin tried to reassure Sarah again that they were going to be safe and that he'll stay up all night and she should just go back to bed. Sarah tried to sleep, but she could not fall back asleep after that. And Kevin just sat up in the tent listening just to see if those people came back towards the tent. At about 4:30 in the morning, the sound of those rocks hitting the tent again came back. Now Kevin was absolutely furious, so he unzipped the tent and he stepped outside. As soon as he did that, he held his pistol up in the air and he fired off the entire magazine. As soon as he did that, they heard something take off running into the bush away from camp. So Kevin instantly reloaded his pistol and he went back into the tent. He told Sarah, don't worry, they're not coming back, not after that. And he told her to try to get some sleep, that it was almost dawn, and once dawn came, they would pack up and they would leave. About a half hour later, Kevin's sitting there and he could hear something moving through the bush towards the tent. So now he was even more angry, so he just yelled out, F off. And as soon as he did that, all of a sudden they heard one of those camp chairs sitting by the fire pit get absolutely crushed by something. It sounded something heavy. They weren't sure at that point if it was a log or if it was a big rock, but they definitely heard something hit that chair and absolutely crush it. So again, Kevin just unzipped the tent a little bit and he fired off an entire magazine into the ground. As soon as he did that, again, this thing took off and ran into the trees. Shortly thereafter, as the sun started to come up, Kevin told Sarah, that's it, we're packing up, let's get out of here. So as Sarah was kind of grabbing all her stuff, Kevin was standing outside the tent just kind of watching the tree line with his pistol in his hand just in case whoever or whatever that was came back. Once Sarah had all of her stuff packed up, they'd start to pack the tent up, and that's when Kevin noticed that that camp chair that got crushed was actually crushed by a boulder that was almost twice the size of his head. That made him at this point incredibly nervous because he knew that there's no way a person could throw this giant rock. So he was feeling very uncomfortable at this point. So he was kind of trying to rush and pack everything up, but he kept telling Sarah, we gotta go, we gotta go, we gotta go. Once they got all their stuff packed, got them in the kayaks, they hopped in the kayaks and they pushed off out onto the lake. They had only been paddling for a couple of seconds. Kevin was in the lead, and he heard Sarah behind him let out this blood-curdling scream. So he quickly whipped his head around, and when he did that, standing there on the shore, right where their camp had been, was this 10 to 11 foot tall Sasquatch just staring at them. So Kevin quickly grabbed his pistol and was about to fire a shot into the air when this Sasquatch let out a wah, and then it threw a softball-sized rock directly towards Kevin's kayak. It didn't hit him, it hit the water, but that was enough for Kevin and Sarah to just start paddling like they had never paddled before. As they were coming out onto the main part of the lake itself, they came across a couple of guys fishing, and they actually asked Kevin and Sarah about the gunfire that night. They had been camping not too far away, so they heard all those shots, and Kevin just told them that he was firing those shots off to scare a bear. Both Kevin and Sarah both agree that if this Sasquatch wanted to get them, it could have got them at any time. And Kevin figures that his 9mm would have done pretty much nothing to deter that. They still go out into the woods, they still go camping, they still go backcountry camping. But their advice is not to be scared to go out into the woods. But when you're out of the woods, if you pick up on any of those little subtleties or any of those warnings, in this case, when those rocks were being thrown at the tent or when their chairs were being moved around the camp, they said if you pick up on anything like that while you're out in the bush, especially if you're out backcountry, they said take that as a warning that there's something there that does not want you there, and just kind of pack your stuff up and leave. Well, that's it for today's encounter. As always, thanks for joining us, and if you haven't done so already, please don't forget to take that subscribe button camping and reassure it that those sounds outside the tent are just a bear, and I'll see you next time.